All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Beth Cronk. I'm the Meeker County Librarian for Pioneerland Library System. And on behalf of the Litchfield Library, I'd like to welcome everybody tonight. It's a shame we aren't all gathering in person at the Litchfield Library as we originally imagined when we started planning this, but I'm very grateful to the St. Paul Friends that we're able to do this as a virtual event for all of you. So thank you to the Friends and to the authors tonight for providing this program for us.
So welcome. We're so pleased to be partnering with Litchfield and the Pioneerland Library System and to have all of you joining us for this event in the Moving Words Writers Across Minnesota virtual series featuring the talents of Allen Eskens, Hwang, Sheila O'Connor, and Khao. I'm Wendy Worden, Programs and Services Assistant at the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, which is the Library of Congress designated Minnesota Center for the Book. As we get started today, we would like to acknowledge the Dakota people, indigenous keepers of the land from which I broadcast on the St. Paul side. This land was reserved by the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. I also want to acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow indigenous inhabitants of this land. Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of stories in this place now called Minnesota, and we at the Friends honor that tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state today. The Friends has coordinated the year-long Minnesota Book Awards program for 14 years, and as Minnesota's Center for the Book, we produce programming that benefits all ages and reaches all corners of the state. This programming is supported by funding for the Center for the Book included in Minnesota's K-12 education bill. We are grateful to all the state representatives and senators who advocated for that funding. On to our main event. This series was made possible in part by the state of Minnesota through a grant to the Minnesota Department of Education, and additional support is provided by the Harlan Boss Foundation and Education Minnesota. We have a reading and conversation followed by a Q&A with you, our audience. Biographies of each panelist will be posted in the chat by our good friend Amelia, who will also be feeding me questions as you have them this evening, and I will relay them in the second half of the program. Next Chapter bookseller in St. Paul has put together a great webpage to make purchasing books from our featured authors easy, so please visit their website or your favorite local bookseller to find books. To start things off, we'll have a brief reading and presentation from each author. First, I'd like to welcome Allen Eskens, who writes books that intertwine to form their own very real universe, and most recently, Nothing More Dangerous. Allen, welcome.
Hi, glad to be here. So my name is Allen Eskens, and I'm here to talk about my 6th novel, which was nominated for a Minnesota Book Award. It's called Nothing More Dangerous. And it is my 6th novel, but it is actually the first novel that I wrote. So I get out of law school in 1991. I graduated December of 1991. And I come to St. Peter, Minnesota, and I begin my law practice. And almost immediately, I realized that I need to do something creative because I have a theater background and I had a creative side that I needed to exercise. So I'd never written a short story before or any story. And I just sat down in my office one day and I started writing this short story about a 14-year-old boy growing up in Missouri, where I grew up. And I kind of liked this character that I created. So I started playing around with the story, and I started taking classes on writing craft. And I took a lot of classes down at the Iowa Summer Writers Festival. I took classes at the Loft Literary Center. I eventually entered the MFA program in Mankato. I spent 20 years in my spare time working on this story. And the story morphed from being a short story about a 14-year-old boy who daydreams, and it became a coming-of-age story. And the journey that my protagonist, Bodhi Sandon, makes is a journey that I made. And it started with me growing up in Missouri and having a very inappropriate understanding of race relations. I grew up in the 70s, so we were post, the 1960s era, and there was this sense that blacks and whites were equal in law, but in our society they were not. And as I went away from home, went to college, went to law school, grew as a human being, I came to understand how warped my sense of race relations was back when I was a kid. So when I was writing this story about this 14-year-old boy, I gave him the journey that I took. Although my journey took, decades, his journey happens over the course of a single summer. So the story takes place in 1976. Bodhi Sandon is 14 years old. He lives in a town called Jessup, Missouri. It's a fictional town. And he lives with his mother on this dead-end gravel road out in the woods. Bodhi is a kid who wants desperately to get away from there, run away from home. He's not happy with any aspect of his life. And the story begins to change when a family moves in across the road from Bodhi. Now, this dead-end gravel road he lives on, there's he and his mother. There's a next-door neighbor named Hwang, who's an older gentleman who has his own secrets. There's a drywall company down at the end of the road, and that's it. And so when this family moves in, there's a young man in this family who is Bodhi's age. And the family is black, and Bodhi's white. This is the first time in Bodhi's life that he has had face-to-face contact with someone of another race. And so it is a mystery, because I'm considered a mystery writer, but it's really a coming-of-age story. It is a story of this young man coming to understand notions of us and them. And I'm going to read a little bit from the novel. The passage that I'm going to read takes place fairly deep into the novel. Bodhi and his new friend, Thomas, the young black man, a boy, were walking down a gravel road, dirt road, and this truck comes by, and a guy sticks his head out of the truck passenger window and swings at them with a broom handle and hits Bodhi. So the passage I'm reading is, after that happens, Bodhi comes home and he's going to tell his neighbor Hwang about what happened. After supper, Mom went home and I stayed behind to help Thomas with the dishes. Mom's idea, not mine. After dishes, I said my goodbyes. Outside on the western horizon, the tail end of a storm broke above the hills, and the setting sun exploded against the clouds in waves of gold and purple and red. As I took a moment to admire the colors, I heard the screech of Hwang's front door. Figuring he probably hadn't heard all that happened, I made my way over to tell him about the attack, laying the story out in great detail, because Hwang, more than anyone I knew, appreciated the small details. He studied my expression during most of the retelling, but toward the end, he let his gaze wander out to the woods, looking at nothing in particular, just slowly moving back and forth. When I finished, he gave a sigh and said, "I'm sorry, Bodhi." "What are you sorry for?" I said. "You didn't do nothing." "I should have warned you about the danger," he said. "Remember when we talked about folks trying to feel like they belong by putting others down, us versus them?" "Yeah." "Well, it runs much deeper than that." Hwang leaned back in his chair, fixing his eyes on something far away, the way he always did when he's about to go deep. "In a perfect world, ignorant notions should die a quick death," he said. "A thing like racism, if it can't find a kindred spirit, it's like a dog barking at a stone. But if you can find just one other person who thinks like you do, well, even the most irrational belief can grow roots. Small-minded people feed off each other, and before you know it, you have mobs, and you have burning crosses, and you have lynchings. But we didn't do nothing to them. They had no cause to come after us the way they did. Men like that, they don't need much in the way of cause. All it takes is a couple guys angry over something, looking for someone to blame. It's like Dr. King said, nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance. Sometimes I think that's the truest thing a man's ever said. He was swinging for my head like he wanted to kill me. Bodie, you ever heard of a boy named Emmett Till? Is he from Jessup? No. Emmett Till was a black kid from Chicago. He was 14 back in 1955 when he took a trip down to visit some relatives in Mississippi. While he was there, he talked to a white woman. Not long after that, a couple good old boys with guns took Emmett from his uncle's house. Just took him. 3 days later, they found the boy's body in a river with a cotton gin fan tied around his neck. Jesus. And all because they didn't like the way he talked to a white woman. But that was a long time ago, before I was even born. They put a stop to all that stuff because they passed those civil rights laws. Bodie, the men who beat and murdered those folks for all those years, do you think they simply disappeared because someone passed a law? A quiet sadness wrapped around Hoke's words as he spoke, as though he held himself responsible for the sins of people who came before him. Do you think those folks just figured out that what they was doing was wrong and went home? No, but things are different now, ain't they? I wish to God they were, but that stuff still happens. Maybe not the same way as what happened to Emmett Till, but it's out there. Always will be. Not always. People change. People can change if they want to, but the sad truth is that humans are hardwired to be prejudiced. It's passed down from ancestors who were just trying to figure out what to fear and what to hunt. We learn to separate things into good and bad, and that particular human frailty is alive and well in every one of us. It's not a matter of if we have prejudices. We do. It's a matter of understanding those instincts and fighting against them. Hope pulled out a pipe and worked through the ritual of packing tobacco into it. I wanted to argue against what he said, but frankly, his story about Emmett Till scared the crap out of me, and I began to contemplate the short walk between getting hit with a broom handle and getting beat to death with it. So that's the kind of the crux of the story. And the thing is, I wrote that passage, that chapter back in 1992, 93, thinking that this was just a story that would be about how it used to be. And one of the things that reviewers and people who send me emails and stuff have brought up over and over is how that notion, that conversation they just had is so relevant to today. This was never meant to be prescient, but it has become that way. This book has, one of the points that Hoke is trying to make is that people are that way. The title comes from, there's nothing more dangerous than sincere ignorance. Until that level of ignorance of other people is overcome, those notions will always be there. So that's my 10 minutes, and I will pass it back to Wendy now.
Wise use of 10 minutes. Thank you for bringing in the sense that you can really have a conversation with yourself through the writing process, and learn things that way. I think that's a fantastic and valuable insight to have as a writer. So I thank you.
Thank you. And that's really what this book, that's why I wrote it, was to have a conversation with myself. I wrote it just for my own edification. I never really thought that I would ever go be a published author. And so I never thought I would see print, but it was something that I needed to work through for myself.
Thanks. Our next presenter this evening is the poet Sue Hwang. And Sue's book Bodega won last year's award in poetry. She is the co-founder of Poetry Asylum with fellow poet Sanyang Shin, and she is a teacher in the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop. So please welcome Sue Hwang.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much. And just wanted to say very quickly, thank you to everyone at the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, everyone with the Minnesota Book Awards, and to Beth tonight, and everyone at Litchfield Public Library. I'm sorry we're not able to gather together in person, but this is still such an honor, and I feel really privileged to share space virtually with Allen, Sheila, and Kalia. So thank you for having me. And I do feel like going next after Allen is sort of a fitting segue into my own work. So just very briefly talking about my debut poetry collection, Bodega, which actually launched exactly a year ago today, or actually yesterday, with Milkweed Editions. And as a child of Korean immigrants, my parents owned a small corner store in the Queensbridge projects in New York City in the 80s and 90s. And around the time of the 1992 Los Angeles riots. So a lot of the book talks about, the issues of that time, but it also feels really relevant today, which I wasn't really planning on when I wrote the book, but I guess this is the world that we live in right now. And so for those who don't know what bodegas are, since we are living in Minnesota now, they're ubiquitous in New York City. They're these small corner stores that service the immediate community. And they offer a gamut of goods like cigarettes to, sodas, diapers, whatever you can possibly need. And in the book, I was trying to employ the metaphor of this urban communal space to explore themes surrounding race and identity, conflict within marginalized communities, class, culture, family, through the lens of a coming of age story, just like Allen's book there. So I'm gonna actually read 3 poems from the collection, and then we'll move on. The first poem is the opening poem. It's titled Instant Scratch Off. Manholes hiss secrets. Inside a transistor radio with foil-tipped antenna sputters the Yankees doubleheader. Top of the 3rd inning. Swing and a miss. A Puerto Rican man sitting behind the counter looks out into the street, picks a scab off his thumb as a little bell rings. Gust of wet heat enters with an elderly Nigerian man wearing a beret and leather vest, trumpet case in one hand and wooden cane in the other, his salt and pepper hair gathered into a seahorse. He has a distinctive gait, something between a hop and shuffle, disappears into the back aisle. The Puerto Rican man hears the suction of the fridge door as the bell rings. A Pakistani man in a maroon turban and brown polyester pants sighs as he wipes his brow, thankful for the Arctic blast. Dark circles under his armpits confirm the broken air conditioner that's cost him fares all day. The rookie shortstop hits another fly ball with 2 men on base for the final out, a collective moan. Pipe organ frolics over the babble as they break for another commercial. Fridge door opens and closes again. The Nigerian man reaches the counter with a peach Snapple and 2 cans of cat food. The Puerto Rican man punches in the usual numbers, 16, 6, 32, 8, 7, 25, and hands over 3 scratch cards. Fistful of change clangs on the laminate counter like cowrie shells, dollar short. The Pakistani man pushes a second rumpled bill over the chaos of coins, signals 2 with his fingers and a wave. The Puerto Rican man shoos them back into the inferno like his mama used to, clutching their icy drinks and their money. This next poem is actually a sonnet sequence. Where did it go? Okay. Fresh off the boat, 5 sonnets. 1. First memory, looking out the window. Earphones stuttering a litany of vowels and consonants, a, ah, and apple. Don't think I understood what was really happening. Our maiden flight from Seoul to an unknown destination, Maryland, then New York City. We went from living in a brick house with a yard to a storage room in the back of a dry cleaner's. No proper shower, just a rusted sink and toilet. I was barely 8 when I kept a photo of a boy under my pillow, an artifact of a fading past. Mom found it, ripped it up, told me to keep my head straight. 2. Leaned across the counter, called us stupid chinks. Go back to where you came from, as if it were that easy. My parents stood like totems, stone-faced. In defiance, they said Hugin, a word for darkness, a distancing. Fear wedged in everyone's eyes, listener and speaker in both directions. Names volleyed like capsules of venom. Ache and anguish hanging like lethal tendrils in a jungle where the ants don't carry their dead. I wanted to shout, stop it, but only mustered a fevered sigh, holding my brother tight as he cried. Silence, a fissure, stalemate, a failure. 3. On special occasions, we'd head to Red Lobster or Sizzler, sit in a vinyl booth, feel luxurious, pretend we were royalty for an evening. I loved the shrimp scampi. My brother always opted for the buffet. And if they could, my parents would have put kimchi on everything. Whenever they asked waitresses questions in their broken English, I'd sulk into my sticky seat, my cheeks boiling, my claws grappling the air. Our outings became few and far between. I'd proved terrible in math. No hope of getting into Harvard, Princeton, or Yale, of becoming a doctor or engineer. 4. Bulletproof glass is not skin, not porous nor forgiving. It keeps everything in and people out like a pallet of hard ice. Cash is locked away, a hegemonic set. He held her at gunpoint, barrel aimed for the temple. She kept her arms raised until he, a kid, turned the corner, sprinting away with the baseball cap, pager, things made in China, and what was in the register, a few measly dollars. But this was the price of doing business in the projects, where we were trapped inside human cages, binding us in a strange circus, where atoms of haves and have-nots always forcefully collide. 5. Summers, they'd send us to Korean school, 2 brats whining. Nobody else had to study SAT geometry at overnight camp. My brother proved an ace at taking tests, so I conspired ways to break a rule or two. Nothing unruly, just idled behind dumpsters, learning best modes to fit in, be none other. Wishing I looked like Barbie or Nancy Drew, my slanted eyes always sleuthing for costumes to obscure my jaundiced skin. A lizard without proper camouflage is killed in the wild. I wanted to sever my mother tongue, regenerate anew. But how could I have known language is lost when left to rot like a pest? And the final poem tonight, and thank you for everyone for being here. I can't see you, but For those of you who are here, thank you. It's titled American Seismology, Queensbridge Projects, New York City, 1989. In the hall of our store with an elevated counter, I watched my mother rock away hours to hawk weaves of braided hair, water guns, gold chains, Knickerbocker wares, AAA batteries behind bulletproof glass, walls outfitted with fake designer apparel. As my father duplicated skylines of brass keys, the machine's timbre rising above the base of souped up cars, I manned the rusty cash register during summer breaks, we three waking at dawn to make the trek below the bridge where struts and trusses lanced shadows across the East River, high rises towering like distant mountain ranges. Out front, prides of wise men lingered on milk crates to rattle the day's news, rolling loose tobacco against limp dollar bills, while children chased on worn astroturf lawns behind wrought iron palisades with nowhere else to play. Hulking concrete monsters lurked above, their curtained eyes, barbed teeth ready to devour heads, eviscerate, incarcerate. As women, young and old, sat on nearby stoops to escape the siren heat, humming age psalms, they cradled cooing newborns to their chests. Please, Lord, have mercy. As bands of white rookie cops circled a 5-block radius, hitting their nightsticks against accordion metal fences, memorizing faces to incarcerate, eviscerate. I'd count down the minutes till 6 o'clock when my parents switched off the lights, taking stock of these terrible hierarchies, wages stuffed into the lining of their pants, while I idled in the car as they locked up, the engine running. Thank you.
Yay, clapping, happy poetry noises, yay. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoy this collection. I've wanted to tell you that, I think, since the first time that I went through it, so I'm really honored to be able to tell it to you in person, such as it is this way.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you.
Yeah, it's so visual, and I hadn't thought in forever about how luxurious Red Lobster felt as a kid until reading that again.
Yeah.
My parents owned their own business, and so it was a fancy
really?
thing for us too.
Yeah. Well, anytime it connects with any reader, I'm just so pleased. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Our third guest this evening is Sheila O'Connor, whose novel, The Evidence of V, won last year's award in novel and short story. And Sheila teaches writing at Hamline University, and I'm really pleased to welcome her here this evening. Sheila.
Thank you to Wendy, and thank you to everyone hosting us this evening in the Litchfield Library and the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, the Minnesota Book Awards, and my fellow writers, these amazing talents that I'm here listening to tonight. It's just, I'm finding myself kind of breathless being in the audience and completely losing track of anything I was going to say. I'm so carried away by this work. But I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about the book Evidence of V. It won the novel and short story category in the Minnesota Book Award this year, which was a huge honor. The book is called A Novel in Fragments, Facts, and Fiction, and it's actually technically what they call a hybrid work because it combines fictional story with archival documents, photographs, reports, things that actually exist. And in that way, for me, the book works as kind of a collage or a puzzle. And as I am piecing together a story, the reader is piecing together the story with me. The book is inspired, Evidence of V. V is the initial of the first name of my maternal grandmother, a woman that I did not know and never met. But she gave birth to my mother at the age of 15. She was 15 years old, and she gave birth to my mother while incarcerated at the Minnesota State School for Girls in Sauk Center, Minnesota, which was under the Minnesota prison system. And I learned of this fact about my maternal grandmother in 2001 after petitioning the courts to open the documents that were housed at the Minnesota Historical Society and the Gale Family Library, where they are holding all of the documents of the girls that were incarcerated during these years that the Minnesota Homeschool for Girls was in existence. But I had found out that year in 2001 that my mother's file and her birth mother's file could be found there, but I was also told at that time that the file was sealed for 100 years. And the idea that this story was both kept from me for so many years. By that time, I was, I think, in my mid 40s by that time, and that it would be kept from me for years beyond the time that I would be alive or that my mother would be alive was devastating. So when we petitioned the court agreed with our petition that full disclosure was in the best interest of the family. And my mother and I went in and we looked at this file, and for the first time we learned her history. And that was the beginning of me discovering even this story of her being born in Sauk Center and my maternal grandmother being incarcerated at 15. As I sat there with the file, I could not make sense of what she had done at 15 to be incarcerated. Very first thing at the file at the top says inmate and then her name. So there was no question. It wasn't a lovely unwed mother's home, as people like to think of it, or, you know, a place to shelter girls. It really was under the prison system. And when she was sentenced in 1935, she was sentenced for 6 years. I saw that immediately in the file when I saw the document from the court telling the sheriff to deliver her there and to keep her there until the age of 21. This was quite devastating to me to think about this 15-year-old girl, whoever she was, and my mother being born under these circumstances, but I couldn't understand what she had done to be incarcerated for 6 years. It took me another 15 years to answer that question. And what I came to discover through breadcrumbs, really, because there just is so little information available, but really kind of just excavating anything that I could find about this place and about the girls who had been held there, I learned that the girls were primarily sentenced for immorality. At the time that she was sentenced, there was only 4 girls who were sentenced for something else, and it was actually incorrigibility. So incorrigibility, immorality, and what did that mean? And I also learned that all the girls under the laws of the state of Minnesota were incarcerated until the age of 21, whether they were incarcerated as an 8-year-old or a 13-year-old or as a 15-year-old, their sentence would last until 21. In the final 3 years of their sentence, they had been trained to be house servants in the time that they were at this reformatory. And then for the final 3 years of their sentence, they were paroled as house servants into good Christian families. My own grandmother, as I discovered in the school ledger, actually had escaped from parole, beginning what would have been for her a life as a fugitive. She never was able to come back to Minnesota or be with her family or resume the life that she had had before she had received that sentence for being pregnant with my mother. So this was really difficult material personally, but what I hadn't expected when I set out on this search is that I would uncover the story of thousands of girls across Minnesota and tens of thousands of girls across the United States incarcerated for immorality or in danger of becoming immoral under this exact same system of being kept, you know, for these incredibly long sentences and then paroled as house servants in the 1930s. When I published this book and when I worked on this book, I believed that there would be others and that survivors of these girls, the descendants of the girls and the girls themselves might possibly come forward with this story brought to light, and that has happened. That's been probably the most important thing for me that has happened with the publication of the book. So I'm just going to read a few pages from the opening of it, including an epigraph which appeared in the St. Cloud Daily Times and Daily Journal Press on May 4th, 1937. One of the main faults of the girls, who are a healthy lot and with few social diseases, is that of lying. And that was the idea of the girls being liars, which is brought up about them over and over again, was particularly important as I looked at their files and saw that what I was looking at were institutional lies told over and over about the girls and about their families, and blaming the girls for being victims of sexual abuse and doing nothing to the men who had been responsible. So the book begins with a small piece, Where to Start V's Story. V at 15 in 1935. V sentenced until 21 for what? V, the family secret I discovered at 16. My mother's missing mother, never mentioned to me once. Shh. The sound of V is silence. Girl of sealed history like all those other girls. Sealed, therefore buried. State documents I now excavate for answers. An official file of fact that reads like fiction. V, of fiction built of fragments, as girls so often are. One of the things about V is that she was extremely talented singer and performer, and that was in the file, and I was able to validate that through other historical sources. And this for me is sort of the beginning of how her story starts. How it starts, Minneapolis, 1935. V floats like a feather far from school, late November loose, a pain in her back tooth that can't be fixed. Hunger acid in her belly, her best friend M beside her, a tether to this world. Always V and M end up downtown. V performing on the streets, singing for the men who still have money for young girls. A dime a dance, M calls, a nickel for a song. M, the stubborn banker, holds the sailor cap for coins, money they will save for a picture show and popcorn, or a quick stop at the Lolly Jar on 6th. V cans and she shimmies, sings, Ain't We Got Fun, then lands hard for a laugh. 1 week into 15, V's a red-haired Ruby Keeler, a Ziegfeld Follies hopeful, sure she'll be discovered. V has what it takes to be a star. You've got talent, one man says, his face as clean as a fresh page, his hands as smooth as snow, his thumb under her chin, like a good father. V's good father has been dead for 5 hard years. You shouldn't waste it on the street. I could put you on the stage. The stage, V says, her heart falling to his hands. How much, M asks. M is the accountant. M always knows exactly what V's worth. More than this, he says, pulling a quarter from his pocket and slipping it in V's. More than you earn now. So in many ways, this is in conversation with Sue's work about just being the daughter of immigrants and a first generation child trying to navigate the life in an urban setting of Minneapolis and earning money for the family as a performer, and all of that leading to this incarceration. So many of the girls who were incarcerated were children of immigrants. And so I think even though this is a story set in 1935, as Allen said about his own work, it's actually a story that has everything to do with where we are now. So thank you, and thanks for giving me a chance to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Every time I hear you talk about this book, I notice something else and some other little resonance hits me. So I just really, really appreciate you being here. And like, there's a one-word poem in incorrigible. Like, there's just something there in that not allowed to be a kidness and all of it just hit me tonight, really. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for all your support for the book too. And the girls, thank you.
Yes, I feel them. Our final author to speak in this first half of the program will be Khaliya Yang, and she just launched her most recent children's book, The Most Beautiful Thing. And in November, she will release Somewhere in the Unknown World, a collective refugee memoir. Please welcome Khaliya.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you to all my fellow writers. I'm always moved by your work and inspired. So thank you for your voices. Thank you to the Litchfield Public Library and to all the public libraries for the work you do, now more necessary than ever before. As Wendy said, I just launched The Most Beautiful Thing. We launched it on Saturday with offer because the art is exquisite. But today, the actual pub date, books come out on Tuesdays in America, anyone who's not aware. So I'm going to read The Most Beautiful Thing. This is my third children's book. Just last year, exactly almost to the date, I launched A Map into the World. And then in June, I launched The Shared Room. So I am excited at the work that this book will take, and I'm excited to share with you tonight. The Most Beautiful Thing by Khao, Kalia, Yang, illustrated by Lei. One of the most beautiful end pages I've ever seen. I'm not biased at all. The dedication, this is mine. The everlasting beauty of grandmother's smile. Zhuo Li, the grandma I took, and Zhuo Ta, the grandma I never got to meet, but who shines through my mother. This is Kwa's dedication. Grandma who forgot everything, but will never be forgotten. The most beautiful thing. My grandmother is so old, no one knows how old she is. Not me, not my big sister Dao, not older cousin Lei. My father waits patiently when we try to guess her age. He is grandma's ninth and youngest child, and even he doesn't know how old she is. We know that my grandma was born on the other side of the world, across a wide ocean. My grandma came from a time and a place where creatures lurked in the jungles, waiting to chase unwary children. She told us that she once looked into the gleaming eyes of a tiger and felt its hot breath on her face. By the time I was born, my grandmother already had an old woman's face. Her skin was soft but dry like paper, and in her mouth was a single tooth. Grandma said, "It is the only thing standing strong in my mouth, this final true tooth that my mother and father gave me." I asked to see a picture of her parents. She said, "They lived in a time long before the mom learned of such things as photographs." I pointed to her heart. "The only picture I have of them is here." Luckiest of the grandchildren got to help care of Grandma. We got to wash Grandma's clothes by hand at the bathroom sink with sweet-smelling pink soap. got to wash Grandma's soft brown back in the bathtub with a soapy cloth. And me, I got to clip her fingernails and toenails while Grandma sat on her favorite stool with the light from the window. I can still feel the roughness of Grandma's heels in my hand, the thickness of her toenails in my fingers. I can see the bottoms of her feet, thick and brown and broken. Deep cracks filled with dirt from ago and far away. Grandma told me that her mother and father died when she was a little girl. Grandma was just a child herself, but she had to take care of 2 young brothers and baby sister. I looked at my grandma from the place where I sat at her feet, and I asked her, "How did you get food for them?" I said, "I find enough food. We lived always with hunger eating us on the inside." My life with her, even just her one tooth, Grandma never said no when we offered her something to eat. The ice cream truck was seen along from down the street. I looked underneath the cupboard quarters. There were none. So I got ice cubes from the freezer. I offered one to Grandma in my red plastic cup. She smiled at me. When I wanted a new dress to wear in the 1st, 3rd grade, my mother said she did not have enough money. She found some bills and a dime in her purse and offered them to me. I bought hard peppermint candies from the neighborhood grocery at the corner of our block. When I got home, I offered one to Grandma on the palm of my hand. She smiled at me. At the round table with shaky legs, I used my spoon to mix in the center soup bowl we all shared. There were no pieces of meat, only bones and soft grains. My father said, "The price of meat is too expensive at the market, didn't I found a thick chunk of bone and offered it to Grandma on my spoon. She smiled at me. Plenty of meat only we celebrate among New Year with our aunts, uncles, and cousins. The old table was heavy with whole boiled chickens, more than our family could ever eat. After dinner, our bellies full, my cousins and I sat on the carpet around Grandma and told the stories. She always began. It was a long time ago, I was just a girl. As we listened, our eyes grew round. Ma twisted her fingers one over the other to show us what the hands of Huanzong, jungle spirits the size of children, looked like. She taught us to listen for the cries of the Pi Vai, holding our breath until our hearts pounded in our ears. We were always sad when Aunt Ju called, "Time for the children to clean up." On a cold day, snow blew onto the glass, onto the window panes, and the light was dim. I asked Grandma about the dirt in her feet. She told me to have shoes after her mother and father died. She went shoeless to the mountains to tend to the family field. She ventured into the jungle to look for wild roots, bamboo shoots, and edible mushrooms. And one day, she was chased by a tiger. As she fled, her bare feet broke open on the fallen branches, and she still ran, blood and dirt mixing into clay with each step. I squeezed her feet in my arms and pulled close to my heart. A hug for the hard road she's walked to get to me. Each year, cutting my grandma's nails went faster because I grew stronger and bigger and more able. Each year, Grandma's feet felt smaller and smaller in my hands and my lap. Her stories too slowed passing years. The pauses between her words grew long. Sometimes, as Grandma was looking for the words she lost to the years, I grew distracted from my task, looking at the toys on the floor that needed to be picked up, the unfinished schoolwork, the younger children who needed to be bathed. Her deep, even breathing would call me back to the moment, only to find her eyes closed in sleep, one hand raised against the window to cradle her head. I grew unhappy with our life. I was tired of getting ice cubes from the freezer when I wanted ice cream. I was tired of never getting dressed for the first day of school. I was tired of gnawing on the bone in the soup when I wanted meat for myself and my grandma. One evening, I studied my face in the bathroom mirror, wishing my teeth were straight. I came out of the bathroom and said, Mom and Dad, I want braces. Can I have them? My mother looked up from nursing my baby sister and said, we don't have any money, maybe next year. My father looked up from my toddler sister, he was bouncing on his legs, and said, I wish we could get you braces, Minai, but we can't right now. My grandmother looked up from her special stool by the big window. Kalia, she said, look at me. I turned to her in the glow of early evening. The sun was low in the sky, and its golden light fell on her face. Grandma asked, is my smile not beautiful? In that moment, I could see all the times my grandmother had smiled at me. I could taste the cold ice cubes that melted summer's heat from tongues, the sweetness of the hard peppermint candies, and the deep flavors of the bone broth, bowls of boiled cream. Even now, I can still see my grandma's single tooth, white against the shadows, standing tall in her open mouth. Her smile was the most beautiful thing. I'm so proud of this book. It's international, an international collaboration. Khao is a Vietnamese artist, but it is a collaboration that in many ways connects our hearts. We were both tremendous, huge fans of our grandmothers. This story is, of course, based and inspired by real life, and I think it speaks to what I do as a story writer. I really believe that through stories, the stories that my grandma shared with me, I got to meet the little girl that she was. And inside the heart of my grandma, that little girl was always with me. And that explains, I think, so much of why I write the stories I do for kids and why I do the work that I do for adults. The heart beating here is the same heart that sat with my grandma's feet in my arms. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to try to pull myself together a little bit. Thank you very much for that. I am very lucky to have had two grandmothers who were the most beautiful, beautiful humans, and I just miss them all the time. So thank you for bringing them close to me in that reading. I really, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I am doing a job. This has been a beautiful evening. I really appreciate everyone's words and everyone's stories, and I would like to bring everyone around for a question and answer session. So if there are things from the audience, we've got a bit of time for that. And I would like to start by asking a question that occurred to me as I was hosting the last Moving Words event with a bunch of writers of history and nonfiction who all found really interesting people to sort of hang their narratives on. And it made all the difference. And so I'm curious, dear writers, what your earliest or most vivid memory of really connecting with a character or a story might be.
Okay, I'll go first. As I said in my presentation, I wrote the short story about Bodhi, this 14-year-old boy, and that character would not let go of me. So I spent 20 years learning how to write so that I could tell his story. I wasn't a writer before then. That character drew me into the world of writing. So that is, my most endearing character.
If it could be a character, that would be mine. I think that the first storyteller who I really loved was Uncle Ju, and my uncle used to hold his arm like this for all of us. This is in the refugee camps of Thailand, so we didn't have books or anything, and only the luckiest kids could go to the movie houses, which was just a 20-inch screen on a platform, but that was the dream. But my Uncle Ju would spread his arm, and every piece of hair would be a tree. The veins would be rivers running far and fast, and the knuckles were the mountains. On my uncle's arms, everything came to life. And so even now when I write, I always think about the empty page as that spread of an arm. And that's where I create all of my characters, and all of the world comes flooding in at me. Because on the stretch of his arms, I wept so many times over characters I'd never seen, because I fell in love with the landscapes and the storyscapes that came forth from him.
Guess I'll go. Thank you. Wow. My family immigrated to the United States when I was 8 years old, in the early 80s, and I actually have no memory of the first 8 years of my life. So, thinking back, I'm sure that was a very traumatizing experience, coming here as a child. And so if I had to say anything, if I had characters that influenced me, I guess it would just be my parents, because we moved around a lot when we first came to the United States, and they were always sort of the constant, and I think that's why they feature so prominently in my poetry collection. But listening to you, Khaliya, it reminded me of this fairy tale that I was really obsessed with, and I can't remember if I read it in Korean, like translated into Korean, or if it was in English. But I don't know if you remember, it was about these brothers that were made into swans, and the sister, does anyone else know the story? I think it was called Wild Swans, and it's a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. And it's, the father was this widowed king, and he marries a evil witch character. But he basically had 12 children, 11 boys and a girl. And the stepmother basically was jealous and wanted to banish the children. And so she cast a spell basically on the boys, and they turned into swans. And she tried to turn the daughter into a swan, but she was too good. And so she was banished from the kingdom. And she found out somehow that she could turn her brothers back into human form by knitting these sweaters out of nettles. But she also had to take a vow of silence while she did it. And then a prince came into the kingdom and fell in love with her, but she couldn't speak because, she had to save her brothers. And anyway, I just remember this story very vividly. I don't remember a lot of books from that time when I was that young, but I just remember being really obsessed with this story. And I think what really connected me to this fairy tale was this idea of sacrifice, and family, the love of family. Anyway, so that's my answer. I don't know if anyone else remembers reading this fairy tale, but okay.
That is such a hard question, Wendy. It's a really just like, I think this whole thing about thinking back and when did you first come to story, and I'm really not super proud of my answer, but the first storyteller that really captured my imagination was a musician, and it was an album that I had as well, we didn't have books, but there was a record album in the house, and it was Marty Robbins' Gunfighter Ballads. And it was all about being a gunfighter and being a rebel and being, you know, somebody that had escaped prison. You know? Like, I think this is so interesting that my psyche was drawn to this kind of thing. But I mean, all I really ever wanted as a 3 and 4 and 5-year-old child was to have the power of Marty Robbins, you know, and to be like the person with the big iron on my hip, you know, like, it's crazy. But I also think that it speaks to the way that stories can give us a sense of being something other than the life that we're living at the time, you know, and also just, I mean, I've thought about that, like my children when they were young, one loved the Nutcracker and one loved to listen to the theme from Little Mermaid, you know, and then I think of myself with Marty Robbins' Gunfighter Ballads, you know, and what did I hear in that? But what I heard in that was actually power. And I think as a child, that was something that I felt I needed and wanted given all the chaos around me. So that's my strange answer, which I've not given publicly before.
It is a delightful, strange answer, and you heard it here first, audience. We do have a question from the audience also about stories, because this is where we're going tonight, and wondering if you can talk about it, because sometimes writers need to keep things, you know, under wraps a bit, but what character or story is now trying to find its way out of you?
So I have to edit a book proposal, and the book proposal is for a creative nonfiction book, a memoir, my mother's memoir. It's called Return of the Refugee. I don't know where it begins exactly, but I know the moment it ends. 3 years ago, my sister, myself, my mom, my dad, and our brother went back to Laos. My mom's eldest brother, who had raised her because her father died many years ago, he was 78 years old and he was down to 78 pounds. His wife had died, and on a phone call, he said to my mom, "You have to say your goodbye to me now when I'm here so I can hear them, not later when I'm gone." And mom couldn't say anything. And so he said, "I want you to know that you were always the blanket that kept my heart warm after our father died." And our mom just cried. And so Doe and I looked at our credit cards and we're like, dream money for dreams. So we bought plane tickets to return to Laos and Thailand. And I went because they had kicked my father out before. If you read the song Poet, you'll have read that part. And in case they kick him out again, I was gonna stay on Thailand's side with him so Doug could go into Laos with our mom. They almost kicked him out, but we made it in. But the thing is that I know where the book ends. The book ends when we go to my uncle's yard. My grandmother's grave is there. And my mom's, and you know, in the tradition of her clan, there's a tiny little door with for the bees can enter in and out. There are red ants crawling all around. There's this prize bull in the back making noise. There are chickens pecking the ground. But the moment my mother puts her hand on that little door, the ants scatter away. The prize bull goes back into his shed and stops blowing. And the chicken leads her chicks out of the yard. My sister and I left, and all we heard were cries. You know, all these words that we thought our mother had been saving for her mother, they never emerged. Just a little girl, just a young girl that walked away from her. And so that's really kind of where the book ends. My mother is able to be young for a brief moment in time and to cry all of those tears in the spaces of all of the words that she saved. So that's the thing that I've been waiting to write for 39 years, and I'm ready, I think. And so I have to fix up this proposal and send it back in to my agent.
Yeah, I'm not following that.
Anybody? Okay.
Come on, team.
We can do this.
My novels, I write fiction, genre, mystery novels. So my first novel was the story of a young man going to college, and his name was Joe Talbot. And so my subsequent novels took characters from that first novel and started telling their stories. And actually, Bodhi Sandin, that 14-year-old boy in 1976, grows up to be a law professor and is in that first novel as a law professor. But so I have these 4 characters from that novel that I keep telling their stories and let each one take turns being a protagonist. So my next novel coming out next fall will be my first female protagonist, Joe Talbert's girlfriend, Lila Nash. She was in my first novel, my 3rd novel, my 5th novel, and now she's going to have her own. So, and then I have, other characters. Max Rupert is, he wants a story, so I'm going to go back and tell his story. So I have these 4 characters that just keep, asking for their story to be told. So it's fun.
I feel very at a loss for what work I need to do right now in the world. And I'm so totally happy to have other people telling their stories. I can't even tell you. I'm just these stories are filling the world, and these stories are so much better and more interesting than anything I need to be doing right now. So I'm at peace with this. But I do, I am in conversation with, descendants and survivors from the school. And in my big dream, I'd like to find some way to have their stories told by them. I told V, and that's fine, and that's one thing, but I'd like the stories told by other people. And if something could happen in the world to give me the opportunity to compile these stories and have them become a permanent record of what happened to these girls, that's what I'd like to do. But I'm waiting. I'm waiting and just gathering.
I do feel like I'm in the same boat with Sheila there. I'm kind of doing a lot of thinking, not necessarily writing at this point, but I find myself still thinking about my experience the summer of 2017. I was lucky enough to get a residency with Springboard for the Arts, a Hinge residency up in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. And I feel like there's a little bit of convergence with Evidence of V, but it was the residency took place at the old the State Mental Hospital up in Fergus Falls. And it's actually famous for the architecture. It's based on the Kirkbride plan, where you have the tower, the central tower, and the 2 wings that fan out. It was just so fascinating to be at this haunted, pretty much haunted old mental state hospital, where actually a lot of young girls were forced to stay. There was, I think there were a lot of women that were actually dropped off by their husbands because they, instead of getting divorced, they were just like, oh yeah, she's, crazy. She won't listen to me, so therefore she's insane. Anyway, my next collection, I want to sort of explore themes of, madness and mass incarceration. So yeah, I'm still really kind of thinking about how to do that. And I think that's why I was really moved by Sheila's book, because there are just all these gaps in the stories that I've been, you know, hearing, or and I just wasn't sure how I could put it together. But I think reading Evidence of V has sort of, you know, opened my mind to kind of exploring different ways of incorporating, you know, fact and fiction, you know, like facts with fiction in poetry somehow. Anyway, so yeah, it's still kind of a big jumble in my head, but I'm that experience. So it's not you know, it's not necessarily one character, but it's that whole experience and the history of you know, how we've dealt with mental illness in this country, and you know, a lot of those who are incarcerated, you know, are in prisons because a lot of our state mental hospitals were closed after, I think it was like World War II, or after like the Great Depression. There was a lot of hospitals that were closed, and so a lot of people became homeless, and then they were incarcerated. And so there's a whole story I feel like that needs to be told, and so that's something I'm exploring.
I am, yep, my mind is going all kinds of excellent places now. Thank you, all of you, for that. Got a question for Sue about the process of getting your first poetry book published, not specifically the steps, but your internal process. What did you do internally to make that happen?
There was a lot of drinking. No, well, you know, my book was published last year when I was 45 years old. And so there was a lot of years where I struggled with writing and had imposter syndrome, was very insecure. And, you know, for a long time, I actually thought I had to write fiction. I think there was this notion in my head that to be a poet, I mean, you couldn't be a poet. You'd have to be, you know, this like chain smoking, dead white guy with a beret. You know, to be like a legitimate writer, I think I just felt like you needed to write this like great American novel. And Allen, I can't believe you've written like 6 novels. That's just wild to me. So for most of my 20s and 30s, I was sort of just like this aimless, restless person moving around. And it wasn't until it's a long story actually, but anyway, poetry, I guess, found me somehow, and I ended up applying for grad school, like MFA programs, and I ended up getting into the University of Minnesota. And I got here in 2013, and I ended up staying. And so my, you know, the bodega started out as my MFA thesis, basically. And then after I graduated, I just kept working on it and kept working on it. You know, I started submitting it after I graduated from the U, and it was like a finalist a couple times, a semifinalist. And then it was a finalist with Milkweed Editions. It used to be called the Linguist and Venom Prize. Now it's called the Ballard Spar Prize. And I was one of 5 poets, and actually didn't win the prize. Poet Rick Barrett actually ended up choosing Claire Wallman-Holmes' book, which is amazing, called Wilder. And but the publisher at Milkweed actually really connected with the manuscript and wanted to publish it anyway. And so that's how it happened. Thanks for asking. But yeah, there was a lot of drinking involved in the process.
I do appreciate the honesty. Well, friends, I would love to sit here forever. You are all delightful, and I have enjoyed this evening immensely, and I hope you, audience, have done so as well. Our dear Sheila needs to go and teach a class, so I am going to wrap us up, which I don't particularly, again, want to do, but this has been delightful. And thank you again to Beth and the Pioneerland Library System for their partnership on this event. And of course, to Allen, Sue, Sheila, and Khaliya. And audience, we will be sending out a survey after this. Our grant funders love feedback, so please do take a moment to do that. And we are hosting more Moving Words events through November. So if you enjoyed this, please come support more Minnesota writers saying wonderful, beautiful, funny, thoughtful things. And yeah, thank you to all of you.
Thank you, everybody.
Khaliya and everyone
Thank
else. Have a good night.
Stay
Have a good
safe.
night.
Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.